The moment Brenda showed up at my door demanding access to my propane tank, I knew my quiet life in northern Vermont was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I had moved to Burlington just 6 months earlier, buying a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, right near Lake Champlain. The property sat on 2 acres, which was exactly what I wanted after spending 15 years cramped in a Boston apartment working as a software engineer. I had saved enough to retire early at 42, and I wanted peace, quiet, and complete independence. The house came with its own propane tank, a massive 500-gallon setup that I had installed myself, paying out of pocket for everything. It sat on my property, about 30 feet from my back door, and it was mine. All mine. The neighborhood was part of an HOA called Lakeview Heights Community Association, which I stupidly assumed would be one of those hands-off organizations that just made sure people mowed their lawns and painted their houses reasonable colors. The previous owner had mentioned the HOA in passing, saying they were pretty quiet and rarely caused issues. That should have been my first red flag, because nothing in life is ever that simple. Brenda Morrison was the HOA president, a 53-year-old woman with that particular haircut that seemed to be standard issue for people who enjoyed making others miserable. You know the one. Short, heavily highlighted with the back shorter than the front. She wore velour tracksuits in various pastel colors and drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked diagonally across 2 spaces whenever she went to the grocery store. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when she first knocked on my door. I was working on some freelance coding project, just to keep my mind sharp, when I heard the aggressive rapping on my front door. Not a polite knock. The kind of knock that said the person on the other side believed they had every right to interrupt whatever you were doing. I opened the door to find Brenda standing there with a clipboard, naturally, because women like her always had clipboards. Behind her stood 2 other women I recognized from the neighborhood but had never spoken to. "Good morning," I said, trying to be polite despite the interruption. "James Quinton?" Brenda asked, even though she clearly knew who I was. "That's me." "I'm Brenda Morrison, HOA president. We need to discuss your propane tank." I leaned against the door frame. "What about it?" "Well, several residents in the community have expressed interest in converting to propane heat, and since you have that large tank on your property, we've decided it would be most efficient for the community if you shared access to it." I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I said, "You want me to share my propane tank? It's the neighborly thing to do," one of the women behind her chimed in. I later learned her name was Patricia. "The tank that I own that sits on my property that I paid $4,000 to have installed," I clarified. "The HOA bylaws state that residents should contribute to the common good of the community," Brenda said, consulting her clipboard. "We believe shared resources benefit everyone." "Show me where in the bylaws it says I have to share my personal property." Brenda's expression tightened. "We can call an emergency board meeting to amend the bylaws if necessary." "You do that," I said. "But unless and until that happens, my propane tank is mine and mine alone. I paid for it, I maintain it, and I'm the only one using it." "This is extremely selfish of you," the third woman said. "Her name tag, because yes, she was wearing a name tag," said Donna. "Selfish is expecting someone else to subsidize your heating costs," I replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I closed the door before any of them could respond. Through the window, I watched them huddle together in my driveway, Brenda gesturing animatedly while the other 2 nodded along. This was going to be a problem. I could feel it in my bones. 2 days later, I received an official letter from the HOA. It was delivered by certified mail, which should have been overkill for a neighborhood dispute but perfectly encapsulated Brenda's approach to everything. The letter stated that an emergency board meeting had been called for the following Tuesday to discuss community resource sharing initiatives. It also included a thinly veiled threat about consequences for residents who refuse to participate in community improvement efforts. I did my research over the next few days. I pulled out all the paperwork from when I bought the house, reviewed every page of the HOA bylaws, and even consulted with a real estate attorney named Mitchell, who I found through a friend in Boston. Mitchell charged me $200 for an hour consultation, but it was worth every penny. "They can't make you share your personal property," Mitchell told me over the phone. "The HOA bylaws you sent me don't contain any provisions about resource sharing, and even if they tried to amend them, they'd need a majority vote from all homeowners, not just the board. Plus, there are liability issues. If someone else was using your propane and something went wrong, you could be held responsible. So I'm in the clear, legally, yes, but HOAs can make your life difficult in other ways. Document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every conversation. If they start harassing you, you'll need evidence." I took his advice seriously. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA, complete with dates, times, and witnesses when applicable. I also invested in security cameras for my property, installing them at all corners of my house, and one pointed directly at the propane tank. The emergency board meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly sat empty, except for the occasional HOA gathering or neighborhood yard sale. I arrived 10 minutes early to find about 20 people already there, which was impressive considering our HOA only had 32 houses total. Brenda sat at a folding table at the front of the room, flanked by the other board members, Patricia and Donna, plus 2 men I didn't recognize. Everyone looked at me when I walked in, and the murmuring started immediately. "Thank you all for coming," Brenda began once the meeting officially started at 7 p.m. "We're here to discuss an important matter that affects our entire community. As many of you know, propane heating is becoming an increasingly attractive option, especially with natural gas prices rising. One of our residents, James Quinton, has a large propane tank on his property. We believe that sharing this resource would benefit everyone." "I'm not sharing my propane tank," I said immediately, standing up so everyone could hear me. "That tank is my private property. I paid for it, and I'm the only one who has any right to use it." "Nobody's asking you to give it away," one of the board men said. His name was Robert. "We're just suggesting that other residents could connect to it and reimburse you for the propane they use. And who handles the liability when something goes wrong? Who maintains the additional lines? Who monitors usage? Who deals with the propane company when there are disputes about billing?" I asked. "Have any of you thought this through?" The room went quiet. "These are details we can work out," Brenda said dismissively. "The point is that we need to think about what's best for the community as a whole." "What's best for the community is for each homeowner to be responsible for their own heating solutions," I replied. "If people want propane, they can install their own tanks. There's nothing stopping them." "The cost is prohibitive," Patricia said. "If we could share yours, it would save everyone money." "Saving you money is not my responsibility." "This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that destroys communities," Brenda snapped. "You moved into this neighborhood, you agreed to be part of this HOA, and that means contributing to the common good. Show me in the bylaws where it says I have to share my personal property," I challenged. "I've read them cover to cover. That provision doesn't exist." Brenda's face reddened. "We can vote to add it. Go ahead and try. You need a majority of all homeowners, not just the people in this room, and I guarantee you won't get it." I was right about that. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me privately to say they thought the whole idea was ridiculous. A man named Kevin, who lived 3 houses down, shook my head and said, "I don't blame you one bit. If I'd paid for that tank, I wouldn't share it either." But Brenda wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more certified letters from the HOA. The first one threatened fines for failure to comply with community initiatives. The second one cited me for having an unsightly propane tank visible from the street, despite the fact that it was in my backyard and barely visible even if you were actively looking for it. The third one claimed I was in violation of some obscure bylaw about exterior modifications, because apparently the propane tank counted as a modification, even though it had been installed before I bought the house. Each letter came with a $50 fine. I ignored all of them and consulted with Mitchell again. "They're harassing you," he said bluntly. "These fines are bogus. The propane tank doesn't violate any legitimate bylaws, and they can't fine you for refusing to share your property. I'd recommend sending them a cease and desist letter. If they continue, we can discuss further legal action." Mitchell drafted the cease and desist letter, and I sent it via certified mail to Brenda's address. The letter was polite but firm, explaining that the fines were without merit and that any further harassment would result in legal action against both the HOA and Brenda personally. That seemed to quiet things down for about a week. Then winter arrived in earnest. Vermont winters are no joke. By mid-November, we were already seeing temperatures drop below freezing at night, and the first real snowstorm hit right before Thanksgiving. 6 inches of heavy, wet snow that made the whole neighborhood look like a postcard. Beautiful, but cold. My propane tank was full. I'd had it topped off in October, anticipating a long winter. The house stayed cozy and warm, my heating system running efficiently, and I was perfectly comfortable. Then I noticed the cars. It started with one car parked on the street near my property line, just sitting there with the engine running. At first, I thought maybe someone was having car trouble or waiting to pick someone up. But the car stayed there for hours, and when I looked closer, I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, just watching my house. The next day, there were 2 cars. Then 3. I checked my security camera footage and realized what was happening. Brenda and her HOA cronies were watching my house, monitoring my propane usage, looking for any excuse to cause trouble. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit that week. My heating system was working overtime, but I was fine. I had plenty of propane and a well-insulated house. That's when Brenda showed up again. This time she didn't knock. She just walked into my backyard and started examining the propane tank. I saw her on my security camera and immediately went outside. "Get off my property," I said from the back door. She spun around, startled. "I'm conducting an HOA inspection. You have no right to be in my backyard without my permission. Get out now, or I'm calling the police." The HOA has the right to inspect properties for code violations. Not without 24 hours notice and homeowner consent. Read your own bylaws. Get out. She left, but not before taking several photos of the propane tank with her phone. That evening, I got another letter. This one claimed that my propane tank was creating a safety hazard and needed to be inspected by a licensed professional within 7 days at my expense, or I would face daily fines of $100. I called Mitchell immediately. "This is escalating into harassment," he said. "They're clearly targeting you because you won't share the tank. I think it's time we took more aggressive action." I can file a restraining order against Brenda personally, and we can also send a letter to the entire HOA board threatening a lawsuit for harassment." "Do it," I said. But before Mitchell could file anything, the situation got worse. I woke up one morning in early December to find that someone had tampered with the valve on my propane tank. Not enough to cause a leak, but enough that I noticed it had been turned slightly. My security cameras showed a figure approaching the tank around 3 a.m., dressed in dark clothing, face obscured. The figure spent about 5 minutes messing with the valve before leaving. I immediately called the police. The Burlington Police Department sent an officer named Rodriguez to my house that afternoon. He was professional and thorough, reviewing my security footage and taking a statement. "You know who did this?" he asked. "I have suspicions," I said. "I've been having problems with my HOA president. She's been harassing me for months because I won't let other residents use my propane tank." "Tampering with a propane tank is serious," Rodriguez said. "That could be considered criminal mischief at minimum, potentially vandalism, or even reckless endangerment depending on what they did." The valve was turned, but not enough to cause a leak. I think they were trying to drain some propane or test whether they could access it. "The footage isn't clear enough to identify who it was," Rodriguez noted, "but I'll file a report, and you should definitely get better cameras. Also, consider putting a lock on that valve." I took his advice. I installed high-definition cameras with night vision capabilities, and I had a specialized locking mechanism installed on the propane tank valve. The total cost was about $800, but my safety was worth it. Mitchell filed the restraining order against Brenda the following week. The judge granted a temporary order, which meant Brenda had to stay at least 100 feet away from me and my property. The hearing for a permanent order was scheduled for January. That should have been the end of it. But Brenda and her HOA board had other plans. In mid-December, right as the temperature dropped to below zero, I received a notice from my propane supplier. The notice stated that they had received a complaint from my HOA claiming that my tank was in violation of safety codes, and that they could no longer deliver to my address until the issues were resolved. I called the propane company immediately. "This is ridiculous," I told the customer service representative. "My tank was professionally installed and meets all safety codes. Who filed this complaint?" "A Brenda Morrison from your homeowner association," the rep said. "She sent us documentation claiming the tank poses a fire hazard." "That documentation is false. My tank is perfectly safe. I can provide you with the installation records and inspection certificates. I'll need to see those before we can schedule another delivery." I faxed over all the paperwork, which thankfully I had kept meticulously organized. The propane company cleared me within 2 days, but the incident made me realize just how far Brenda was willing to go. The weather continued to deteriorate. By the week before Christmas, Burlington was experiencing one of the coldest winters on record. Temperatures weren't rising above 15 degrees during the day, and at night they were dropping to -10 or worse. The whole state was under a winter weather advisory. That's when other residents started having problems. Most of the homes in our HOA used either electric heat or oil. Electric heat was expensive and struggling to keep up with the cold, while oil deliveries were getting delayed because of the weather and increased demand. People were cold, their heating bills were skyrocketing, and suddenly, my propane tank was looking like a very attractive option. The emails started coming through the HOA mailing list. Several residents were openly advocating for forcing me to share my propane. The messages ranged from passive-aggressive, "Some people don't understand what it means to be part of a community," to outright hostile, James needs to stop being selfish and help his neighbors. I responded once, keeping it simple. My propane tank is my private property. Anyone suggesting otherwise needs to review the legal concept of property rights. That didn't help. If anything, it made people angrier. On December 20th, I had my propane tank topped off again. I was down to about 40%, and with the cold weather continuing, I wanted to make sure I had enough to last through the winter. The delivery truck pulled up right on schedule, and I watched as the driver filled my tank. What I didn't know was that Brenda was watching too. The next day, I received a hand-delivered letter from the HOA. Not certified mail this time, just Brenda's husband dropping it in my mailbox. The letter stated that the HOA board had voted to assess a community resource tax on any resident who refused to share resources with the community. The tax was set at $500 per month, starting immediately. I called Mitchell before I even finished reading the letter. "They can't do that," he said, laughing in disbelief. "That's not how HOAs work. They can't just invent new taxes because they're mad at you." This is completely unenforceable, so I ignore it. Absolutely. In fact, this helps our case. This is clear evidence of targeted harassment. Save that letter. We'll use it at the hearing. The hearing for the permanent restraining order was scheduled for January 8th. In the meantime, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, ever since Brenda first demanded I share the tank. The propane tank was on my property, but it was relatively close to the property line. If the HOA was going to keep making my life difficult, maybe it was time to move the tank somewhere they couldn't harass me about it. I called the propane company and asked about relocation. "It's possible," the technician told me, "but it's not cheap. We'd need to cap the current connection, dig a new foundation, move the tank and run new lines to your house. Looking at probably $3,000, maybe more depending on where you want it moved." I want it moved as far from the street as possible, in a location that's clearly visible only from my property. We can do that, but with the ground frozen, it'll take some extra work. I'll pay whatever it costs. We scheduled the move for January 2nd, right after New Year's. The timing was perfect because it would be done before the restraining order hearing, and it would make a statement. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone, which was fine by me. I'd always been a bit of a loner, and after dealing with Brenda and the HOA for months, I was happy to have some peace and quiet. I made myself a nice dinner, watched some movies, and enjoyed the warmth of my house while the temperature outside dropped to -15. The day after Christmas, the HOA made their boldest move yet. I woke up to find a construction crew in my backyard. Not my crew, not anyone I'd hired, just 5 guys with tools and a small excavator, and they were digging near my propane tank. I ran outside in my bathrobe and slippers, slipping on the ice in my rush. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. One of the workers, a younger guy with a beard, looked confused. "We were hired to install propane connections to this tank. We've got a work order from the homeowner association." "I'm the homeowner and I didn't authorize this. Get off my property now." The worker pulled out his phone and showed me the work order. Sure enough, it had Brenda's signature on it, claiming authorization to improve community infrastructure. "This is fraud," I said. "I'm calling the police." "Stop working immediately." To their credit, the workers stopped. They were just contractors doing a job, and once they realized the situation was sketchy, they packed up and left. But the fact that Brenda had gone this far was shocking even to me. I called the police again. Officer Rodriguez came out again, now familiar with my ongoing situation. "This is getting out of hand," he said, examining the forged work order. Forging documents to authorize construction on someone else's property could be criminal fraud. Do you want to press charges? Absolutely. Rodriguez took statements, collected the work order as evidence, and said he'd follow up with the contractor to verify that Brenda had indeed hired them. He also recommended I contact a civil attorney about suing the HOA for damages. You've got trespassing, harassment, fraud, and attempted vandalism, Rodriguez said. That's a lot of evidence for a civil case. Mitchell was equally shocked when I told him. This woman has lost her mind, he said. I'm going to amend our court filing to include this incident. The judge needs to see the full pattern of harassment. And yes, you should absolutely consider a lawsuit. You've got damages, emotional distress, and clearly documented harassment. The hearing on January 8th couldn't come fast enough, but first, I had my propane tank to move. The crew from the propane company arrived on January 2nd, right on schedule. It took them the entire day, but by evening, my propane tank had been relocated to the far back corner of my property, at least 100 feet from the nearest property line and completely hidden from the street. The new location was perfect. It was close enough to the house that the connection was still efficient, but far enough away that nobody could easily access it without trespassing deep into my property. I also had them install additional security measures. A locked cage around the tank, motion sensor lights, and clear no trespassing signs. The total cost was $3,400, but it was worth every penny just for the peace of mind. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the tank move. I started getting angry phone calls and emails from HOA members, accusing me of being spiteful and vindictive. One email from Patricia said I was condemning my neighbors to freeze by moving the tank where they couldn't access it. I replied, "The tank was never yours to access. Nothing has changed except now it's further from your reach. Install your own propane systems if you want propane heat." The day of the hearing arrived. January 8th was another bitterly cold day, with temperatures hovering around 5 degrees. I dressed in my best suit and met Mitchell at the courthouse in downtown Burlington. Brenda was there with her own attorney, a tired-looking man named Stevens, who had clearly been roped into a case he wanted no part of. The judge was a woman named Henderson, probably in her early 60s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Mitchell presented our case methodically. He showed the judge the timeline of harassment, starting with Brenda's initial demand that I share my propane tank, through all the bogus fines and violations, the trespassing, the tampering with the tank valve, the forged work order, and the ongoing harassment campaign. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, "this isn't a case of neighbors having a simple disagreement. This is a systematic campaign of harassment by an HOA president who believes she can bully a homeowner into surrendering his property rights. Mr. Quinton has done nothing wrong. He simply exercised his legal right to control his own property." Stevens tried to defend Brenda, arguing that she was simply trying to help the community and that I was being unreasonable. "Mr. Quinton has shown a complete unwillingness to cooperate with reasonable community initiatives," Stevens said. "My client was acting in what she believed was the best interest of all residents. By forging documents and hiring contractors to work on his property without permission." Judge Henderson asked, raising an eyebrow. Stevens didn't have a good answer for that. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including my security camera footage, the forged work order, the police reports, and the documentation of all the bogus fines and violations. "I'm granting the permanent restraining order," Judge Henderson said finally. "Mrs. Morrison, you are to stay at least 100 feet away from Mr. Quinton and his property at all times. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly. You are not to send him any letters, emails, or other communications, and you are certainly not to authorize any work on his property or interfere with his propane tank in any way. Do you understand? Brenda's face was bright red. Your Honor, this is my neighborhood. I'm the HOA president. I have responsibilities. Your responsibilities do not include harassing homeowners or attempting to seize their property, the judge interrupted. If you violate this order, you will be held in contempt of court. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Brenda said quietly. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering the HOA to reimburse Mr. Quinton for all costs associated with this harassment, including his legal fees and the cost of relocating his propane tank. I'm also nullifying all fines and violations that were issued against Mr. Quinton related to this matter. Those were clearly retaliatory and without merit. Mitchell smiled. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was celebrating. The hearing wrapped up, and Mitchell and I walked out of the courthouse together. That went well, he said. The judge saw right through their nonsense. You should expect a check from the HOA within 30 days for the reimbursement. What if they don't pay? Then we can put a lien on the HOA's accounts. Trust me, they'll pay. I shook Mitchell's hand and thanked him for his work. The legal fees had been steep, around $4,000 total, but getting reimbursed for everything made it worthwhile. The story should have ended there. But in my experience, people like Brenda don't give up easily. Over the next few weeks, the temperature in Burlington continued to plummet. We were having one of the coldest winters in 50 years, with multiple days where the temperature never got above zero. Several residents in my HOA were having serious problems keeping their homes warm. Electric bills were through the roof, and oil deliveries were backlogged for weeks. People were genuinely suffering, and while I felt some sympathy, I also knew that their problems weren't my responsibility. If they'd wanted propane heat, they could have installed their own systems. The fact that they'd relied on Brenda's ridiculous scheme to take over my tank instead was their own poor judgment. The HOA was forced to cut Brenda a check for $7,600, covering my legal fees and the cost of moving the tank. She delivered it personally to my mailbox, probably to avoid violating the restraining order by getting too close to my house. The check came with no note, no apology, nothing. I deposited it immediately. Then, in early February, things took another turn. I was checking my email one morning when I found a message from Kevin, the neighbor who had supported me during the initial HOA meeting. The subject line said, "Thought you should know." The email contained screenshots of posts from a private Facebook group for the HOA. Apparently, Brenda had been running a secret campaign against me, trying to rally residents to boycott doing any business with me, vandalizing my property, and spreading false rumors that I was planning to sell my house to developers who would turn the neighborhood into apartments. None of it was true, of course. I had no plans to sell my house, and even if I did, the zoning laws in our area didn't allow for apartment buildings. But the fact that Brenda was still actively working against me, despite the restraining order and the judge's ruling, was infuriating. I forwarded the screenshots to Mitchell and to Officer Rodriguez. Mitchell immediately filed a motion for contempt of court, arguing that Brenda's social media campaign constituted indirect harassment in violation of the restraining order. The contempt hearing was scheduled for late February. In the meantime, winter raged on. The cold snap continued through February and into early March, which was unusual even for Vermont. My propane tank was handling everything perfectly, keeping my house warm and comfortable while my neighbors struggled. I heard through the grapevine that several families had temporarily moved in with relatives because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. One elderly couple had to be hospitalized for hypothermia after their electric heat couldn't keep up with the cold. It was a serious situation, and I did feel bad for them. But I also knew that my propane tank wouldn't have been enough to heat all 32 houses in the HOA anyway. Even if I'd wanted to share it, which I didn't, the logistics would have been impossible. The tank would have been drained in days, leaving everyone, including me, without heat. The contempt hearing was brief. Judge Henderson reviewed the Facebook posts, noted that Brenda had clearly violated the spirit of the restraining order by continuing to harass me indirectly, and found her in contempt of court. Mrs. Morrison, I warned you at the previous hearing that you needed to leave Mr. Quinton alone, the judge said sternly. You chose to ignore that warning and continue your campaign against him through social media. I'm fining you $1,000 and ordering you to immediately cease all posts, comments, or communications about Mr. Quinton, either directly or indirectly. If you violate this order again, you will face jail time. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Brenda said, her voice barely above a whisper. After that hearing, things finally started to quiet down. The HOA removed Brenda as president through an emergency vote, installing a much more reasonable resident named Thomas, who immediately reached out to apologize on behalf of the organization. What Brenda did was wrong, Thomas told me over the phone. The whole board recognizes that. We want to move forward and put this behind us. No more harassment, no more demands about your propane tank. You have every right to your property. I appreciate that, I said. I never wanted any conflict. I just wanted to be left alone. Understood? And just so you know, several residents are now installing their own propane systems. Your situation kind of opened everyone's eyes to how efficient it is. That made me smile. Maybe some good would come out of this mess after all. Spring finally arrived in late March, and with it came warmer temperatures and the end of the brutal winter. My propane tank had performed flawlessly throughout, and I still had about 30% capacity left, which would easily carry me through until next fall. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Brenda kept to herself, presumably embarrassed by the whole situation and definitely constrained by the restraining order and contempt ruling. The new HOA board under Thomas was hands-off and reasonable, focusing on actual community issues like road maintenance and snow removal, rather than trying to control what residents did with their private property. I learned later, through Kevin, that Brenda's husband had been furious with her over the whole situation. Not only had her crusade cost them over $7,700 in reimbursements to me, plus the $1,000 contempt fine, but her reputation in the neighborhood was destroyed. Several longtime friendships had ended over her behavior, and she'd become something of a pariah. Part of me felt a tiny bit of sympathy, but mostly, I felt vindicated. In early April, I received one last piece of correspondence related to the whole situation. It was a letter from the Vermont Attorney General's office, informing me that they were investigating the HOA's conduct for potential violations of state consumer protection laws. Apparently, several other residents had filed complaints about various issues with the HOA under Brenda's leadership, and my case had added significant evidence to their investigation. I gave a statement to an investigator over the phone, walking through the entire timeline again and providing copies of all my documentation. The investigator told me that if they found violations, the HOA could face fines and Brenda could potentially face criminal charges for the forged work order. What she did was pretty egregious, the investigator told me. Forging documents to authorize construction on someone else's property is fraud, plain and simple. And the pattern of harassment you documented suggests she was abusing her position as HOA president. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, I said. That's exactly why we're investigating. The investigation took several months, but by August, the results came through. The Attorney General's office fined the HOA $15,000 for various violations of consumer protection laws and improper governance practices. Brenda was charged with criminal fraud and harassment. The criminal case went to trial in October, almost a full year after this whole mess began. I had to testify, walking the jury through everything that had happened. It was tedious and a bit stressful, but Mitchell assured me that my testimony was crucial. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both charges. The judge sentenced Brenda to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay restitution to me in the amount of $5,000 for emotional distress and inconvenience. Brenda stood in the courtroom, tears streaming down her face as the judge delivered the sentence. Her husband sat in the gallery, his face a mask of disappointment and resignation. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her cry. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to live quietly in my house with my propane tank and be left alone. After the trial, I walked out of the courthouse into a beautiful October afternoon. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and there was a crisp coolness in the air that promised another winter was on its way. But this time, I was ready. My propane tank was already topped off for the season, sitting safely in the back corner of my property, surrounded by security cameras and locked gates. Nobody was going to bother it, and nobody was going to bother me. Kevin called me that evening to congratulate me on the verdict. "Justice served," he said. "Brenda had it coming. She should have just left you alone." "All of this could have been avoided if people just respected property rights," I said. "You'd think that would be common sense, but apparently not." We chatted for a while longer, and Kevin mentioned that several more neighbors had installed their own propane systems over the summer. The neighborhood was better prepared for winter this year, and everyone seemed to have learned something from the previous year's disaster. Life settled into a comfortable routine. I continued my freelance coding work, took up skiing at some of the local resorts, and generally enjoyed my retirement. The HOA under Thomas's leadership was boring in the best possible way, handling basic maintenance and administrative tasks without any drama. Brenda and her husband moved away the following spring. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they'd sold their house and relocated somewhere in New Hampshire. I didn't ask for details and didn't particularly care. I was just glad the whole ordeal was finally, completely over. The restitution check arrived in December, right before Christmas. $5,000, paid in full. I used part of it to upgrade my home security system and donated the rest to a local charity that helped low-income families with heating costs. It seemed fitting. That second winter was blissfully uneventful. The temperatures were much milder than the previous year, but my propane system kept the house perfectly warm regardless. I never once worried about running out of fuel or dealing with delivery problems. The independence and self-sufficiency I'd wanted when I moved to Vermont had been worth fighting for. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned some valuable lessons. First, never underestimate how far some people will go when they think they're entitled to something that isn't theirs. Second, documentation is everything. Those security cameras and detailed logs were crucial in proving my case. Third, Standing up for your rights is worth it, even when it's difficult and expensive. And fourth, some people just really need to learn that no means no. I still live in that same house today. The propane tank is still in the back corner of my property, still keeping my house warm through Vermont winters, and still very much mine and mine alone. The HOA leaves me alone, my neighbors respect my boundaries, and life is peaceful. Exactly the way I wanted it. The neighborhood has actually become a pretty nice place to live once the drama settled. Thomas proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on genuine community improvements like better street lighting and organizing neighborhood events that people actually enjoyed. The Facebook group that Brenda had used for her hate campaign was shut down and replaced with a much more positive community page where people shared recommendations for local services and organized casual get-togethers. I even started attending some of the neighborhood events. There was a summer barbecue where I actually met quite a few reasonable people who apologized for not speaking up sooner during Brenda's reign of terror. Many of them admitted they'd been intimidated by her and hadn't wanted to rock the boat. She had this way of making you feel like you were being a bad neighbor if you disagreed with her, one woman named Sarah told me at the barbecue. "I'm sorry we didn't support you more publicly. What she did was wrong." "I appreciate that," I told her. "I'm just glad it's over." And it really was over. The restraining order remained in effect even after Brenda moved away, and I never heard from her again. The HOA settled into a rhythm of competent, drama-free management. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased, probably because word got out that we'd cleaned house, and were now one of the better-run HOAs in the area. My propane company added me to their list of preferred customers, always making sure I got priority scheduling for deliveries. The technician who'd moved my tank told me it had become something of a legendary story in their office. "We tell new guys about the time we moved a tank just to spite an HOA president," he said with a grin. "It's a good reminder that we work for the customer, not some busybody neighbor." I wrote a detailed review of my experience on several HOA review websites, not to be vindictive, but to warn potential home buyers about what to look for in HOA bylaws and governance. The reviews got thousands of views and dozens of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. It was strangely therapeutic to know I wasn't alone in dealing with overzealous HOA boards. Mitchell and I stayed in touch, and he actually used my case as an example in a presentation he gave at a legal conference about HOA disputes and property rights. He told me later that several attorneys had reached out to thank him for the presentation, saying it helped them with their own cases. "You struck a nerve," Mitchell told me. "A lot of people are dealing with similar situations, and your case provides a clear roadmap for how to fight back legally." The criminal fraud case against Brenda also set a precedent in Vermont. It was cited in subsequent cases involving HOA misconduct, and some legal experts said it would make HOA boards think twice before engaging in harassment campaigns against homeowners. In a weird way, my stubborn refusal to share my propane tank ended up benefiting a lot of people beyond just myself. 2 years after the initial confrontation, I was sitting on my back porch on a cool October evening, sipping coffee and watching the sunset. My propane tank sat in the distance, partially obscured by some landscaping I'd added. It was just another piece of my property, no more noteworthy than my shed or my garage. But it represented something important, the principle that your property is your own, and nobody has the right to demand you give it up just because it would be convenient for them. I thought about Brenda sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from the experience. I doubted it. People like her rarely accepted responsibility for their actions. She probably blamed me for everything, convinced herself she'd been in the right all along, and moved on to terrorize some other neighborhood in New Hampshire. But that wasn't my problem anymore. Kevin walked over from his house carrying 2 beers. He'd become a good friend over the past couple of years, and we often hung out in the evenings when the weather was nice. "Thought you might want one," he said, handing me a bottle. "Thanks. Beautiful evening." "Sure is. Hey, did you hear? 3 more houses just installed propane systems. Basically half the neighborhood is using propane now." "Really?" "Yep. You started a trend. Everyone saw how well your system worked through that brutal winter, and they wanted the same reliability." "Maybe I should have become a propane salesman," I joked. "You kind of did, just without the commission." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. "You ever regret not just sharing the tank?" Kevin asked eventually. "Might have saved you a lot of trouble." "Not for a second," I said firmly. "It wasn't about the tank. It was about the principle. If I'd given in, Brenda would have just moved on to the next demand and the next one after that. People like her only understand boundaries when you enforce them." "Fair enough. Well, I'm glad you stood your ground. The neighborhood is better for it. Thomas is 1,000 times better than Brenda ever was." "Cheers to that," I said, raising my beer bottle. We clinked bottles and drank as the sun disappeared below the horizon. As another winter approached, I felt completely at peace. My propane tank was ready, my house was secure, and my life was my own. The whole ordeal with Brenda had been stressful and expensive, but it had also taught me that standing up for yourself is always worth it. The HOA never bothered me again about any aspect of my property. In fact, they'd become almost deferential, probably worried that I'd sue them if they stepped out of line. The new board had implemented strict policies about respecting homeowner property rights and requiring unanimous board approval before taking any action that might affect individual properties. I heard through Kevin that Thomas had used my case as a cautionary tale during board meetings, reminding everyone that their job was to serve the community, not to control it. By the 3rd winter, after the initial conflict, the neighborhood had completely transformed. The contentious atmosphere that had existed under Brenda's leadership was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of community. People helped each other out, but they did so voluntarily, out of kindness rather than obligation or coercion. Several neighbors with new propane systems asked me for advice about maintenance and efficiency. I was happy to share what I'd learned, and it felt good to help people on my own terms rather than having help demanded of me. One conversation that stuck with me was with an elderly man named Harold who lived at the end of the street. He'd installed a propane system the previous summer after decades of struggling with expensive oil heat. "I should have done this years ago," Harold told me. "But Brenda always made it seem like propane was your thing, and if anyone else got it, they'd be copying you. She created this weird, competitive atmosphere where people were afraid to make practical decisions because of neighborhood politics." "That's insane," I said. "Tell me about it." "Anyway, I just wanted to thank you. If you hadn't stood up to her, we'd probably still be living under her thumb, making decisions based on her approval rather than what was best for our own families." That conversation crystallized something for me. My fight with Brenda hadn't just been about my propane tank. It had been about freeing the entire neighborhood from her controlling, vindictive leadership. By refusing to back down, I'd inadvertently sparked a larger change that benefited everyone. The last I heard about Brenda came from Kevin about 3 years after the initial incident. He'd run into Patricia, one of Brenda's former cronies, at the grocery store. Patricia had apparently remained in contact with Brenda and mentioned that she was having similar problems with her new HOA in New Hampshire. "Leopards don't change their spots," Kevin said when he told me. "She's probably trying to pull the same nonsense there." "That's their problem now," I said. "I just hope someone stands up to her before she causes too much damage." After what happened here, I bet word has spread. HOA horror stories travel fast on the internet. Someone probably already warned that neighborhood about her. I hoped he was right. As for me, life continued peacefully. I expanded my freelance work a bit, taking on more interesting projects that challenged me intellectually. I started dating a woman named Nicole who worked as a veterinarian in Burlington. She thought my whole propane tank story was hilarious. "You went to war over a propane tank," she said, laughing when I first told her the story. "I went to war over property rights," I corrected. "The propane tank was just the battlefield." "That's very philosophical of you." "I'm a philosophical guy." Nicole and I got serious pretty quickly, and she moved into the house about a year after we started dating. She loved the place, especially the peaceful setting and the reliable heat. She'd lived in apartments with temperamental heating systems for years and couldn't believe how consistent and comfortable the house stayed, even during the coldest winter nights. "This propane system is amazing," she said during our first winter together. "I'm never going back to electric heat." "It's worth fighting for," I said with a smile. We got married the following spring in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Several neighbors came to the wedding, including Kevin, Thomas, and even Harold. It was a beautiful day, and I felt genuinely lucky to have found such a wonderful community after all the drama had settled. The propane tank, still sitting in the back corner of the property, had outlasted Brenda and her schemes. It continued to function perfectly, requiring minimal maintenance and keeping our home comfortable year-round. Every time I paid the quarterly propane bill, which was remarkably affordable compared to other heating options, I felt a little surge of satisfaction. That tank represented my independence, my willingness to stand up for what was right, and my refusal to be bullied into submission. It was more than just a metal cylinder full of fuel. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for when I moved to Vermont: freedom, self-sufficiency, and peace. And absolutely nobody, not Brenda or anyone else, could take that away from me. Looking back now, 5 years after that first confrontation, I can honestly say that moving to Vermont and fighting that battle with the HOA was one of the best decisions I ever made. It taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's hard. It taught me that documentation and legal support are crucial when dealing with unreasonable people. And it taught me that communities are better when they respect individual rights rather than trying to force everyone into some collective vision. The neighborhood thrives now, with reasonable leadership and neighbors who actually like each other. Property values have increased significantly, and several articles have been written about our HOA as an example of how to reform and improve after poor management. My propane tank still sits in the back corner of my property, locked and secure, keeping my house warm and comfortable. Nicole and I are talking about adding an addition to the house, maybe a sunroom or an expanded garage. The HOA board has already approved the plans with no drama, no harassment, and no unreasonable demands, just the way it should be. And on cold winter nights, when I hear the furnace kick on and feel the warm air flowing through the house, I smile and remember the woman who thought she could force me to give up what was mine. She thought wrong.